Okay, so this is highly unpleasant and stark, but it does actually represent the dominance of humanity over the rest of the natural world. Also, it could be used to represent the role of the recent Westminster legislation on the fate of our wildlife. Hedgehogs have had 95% decline since the 1950s and are now vulnerable to extinction. So here's a simple question to start off with. Why does biodiversity matter? So David Attenborough, as you can see, gets to the nub of it, and remember that invertebrates are, contrarily perhaps, the backbone of our biodiversity. But this report from the UN a couple of years ago just shows you how incredibly important biodiversity is. It's not just for the pleasure of seeing nature, it's crucial for our existence in the future. This is a bit more of a challenging slide, I know, but really only as far as the fact that you've got to turn your head to see some of the text. It's my attempt to show what are the main factors that are causing the decline in our biodiversity, and the largest arrows are the most important ones. Undoubtedly that they all have had a presence over time, but some are perhaps more static or constant than others, and I'm rating climate change as very important. Certainly, if not quite now, it's certainly going to get crucially important and will certainly be the number one, I think, closely followed by damage and disturbance in protected sites, nature reserves and other special places. And then we are also increasingly encouraging people to access these sites, which unfortunately is damaging them as well. So I've labelled this as a simple food web diagram showing which way the energy flows. The most important items are the ones in red. In the soil, all sorts of things I've excluded, fungi and so forth, because this is a simplification, but invertebrates there in the soil and elsewhere, and insects generally, are the drivers of our whole ecology. Without them, nothing else would exist. And insect-eating birds and seed-eating birds and mammals are really at the top of the tree, but they do depend on all the other things. So if you imagine a jigsaw puzzle, and all the little bits of a very complicated jigsaw are components made up of how each species is doing. There are many thousands of species, and you also have, over time, things change, and over different areas things change. So to actually wait until we have the complete jigsaw puzzle would be far too late, and then that would be catastrophic. But trying to gather all the information from all little components to see what's happening is quite difficult, particularly since the recording process, which forms the basis of this, needs funding, and the government has pulled the plug effectively on a proper system, and in fact it's mainly supported by charities and volunteers. So if you remember the previous diagram showing the relationship between invertebrates and so on, well, here we have a basic fact that worms have obviously decreased massively in cultivated soils. So that obviously means that there's less food for birds, farmland birds. And so there's been a 57% reduction in farmland birds. And it doesn't end there, of course. You imagine there's not just worms that have decreased, it would be reasonable to say a whole lot of other invertebrates have decreased. You can often see when a field is being ploughed that there's a flock of seagulls pouncing down. It won't be just worms, it'll be all sorts of things in the soil. So those things are being damaged, their populations are being damaged by the process of farming, unfortunately. That is a reality. And then looking at something which we do know something about rather well, because they have been well monitored in the UK. Their numbers have roughly halved in the period 1980 to 2020, and that is serious because hoverflies are one of our major pollinators, and actually also they help to control aphids, and so you can see how these things can go awfully wrong when we don't keep things in balance. Just going back briefly to the last item in the previous slide about hoverflies, this is the trend actually in graphical form since around 1980. You see the downward trend, but the really worrying thing is that the trend recently seems to become steeper downward, which is very worrying indeed. In 2020, the Natural History Museum issued a report on biodiversity. It was mainly focused on the UK, but did cover the whole world actually, but also was pointing out that the UK had led the world in destroying the natural environment. We only have 50.3% remaining, which is one of the worst in the world. So that is something to be utterly ashamed of, and actually leading the world in something that's bad. And unfortunately, the effect on nature is that it's the unfortunate collateral damage as a consequence of humanity's march of progress. And I'm afraid the government's approach is duplicitous. In some respects, they recognise that there's a problem, but the official statistics from Natural England imply it's actually fine. I'm using a little trick here to try and give relevance to the points I'm making, where I'm not actually appearing to present facts about wildlife and its decline, but I'm looking at imaginary UK schools and their academic achievements. And imagine the government says 95% are in good condition or have management in place to ensure that they're improving. You would think, well, that was fine, isn't it? Because it is a rather important matter how we manage our schools. I'm afraid there's another point though, that independent experts say that that figure, 95%, is just not realistic. It's complete and utter distortion of the truth. Quickly going through these points, only about 40% are in good condition. The assessments are many years out of date. Many of the assessments have been found to be misleading or totally wrong. There are insufficient funds to actually make the planned management improvements. There's no government data on the school's academic achievements. It is assumed that if the school is in good condition, so are the academic results. An independent assessment suggests that UK schools' academic results are some of the worst in the world and getting worse. So if that was to apply to schools, you would be utterly appalled and outraged, and you would make sure something was done. But we're talking here actually about what's happening to nature, but nobody seems to be doing anything realistic about it. Now I call that duplicity. It sums it up and it's appalling. So I managed to actually dig out the statistics on the condition of sites of special scientific interest, or otherwise known as SSSIs, in England from 2003 to 2020. So it did take quite a lot of digging out, but it shows you what the figures actually are, and it's really a distortion to say that 95 or 96% are in favourable condition or have management in place to ensure they're recovered. And you can see the length of the bars in this histogram. Things are getting very little better at the moment, and one could extrapolate almost to infinity before they actually reach a satisfactory state. And yet the government states from 2010 in each annual report something varying on this statement here. Over 96% of the area designated as SSSI interest is now in a favourable or recovering condition. So that is the distortion that I think is so wrong. And here is another corruption of the truth. If anything, it's even worse than the previous one. The assumption by the government the national parks and other special areas are in good condition and managed for nature is absurd in the extreme. I get this sense that the government thinks this is some sort of game where they can just make claims justifying their position, and it's up to independent organisations to call their bluff. But it's not a game. We're trying to save our UK wildlife, and once it's gone, we can never get it back. And it's that awful damning word again, duplicity. So, as we've already found out, the UK has lost about half its biodiversity, basically caused by factors that are driven by humanity. And the UK continues to lose this biodiversity, but as you can imagine from that jigsaw puzzle, it's difficult to know what the short-term rates are with a whole range of things. And now, if this huge reduction in numbers of other life forms had happened to a race of humans, then it would be called genocide, wouldn't it? I think that's indisputable. So I know it sounds like strong language, but I think actually calling it ecocide is a proportionate and measured response to the horrendous facts now emerging. Do we just shrug our shoulders with indifference, or act on them with a due sense of urgency? This is another slightly complicated slide, but what I'm attempting to show is, on the left, the government's plans for nature recovery networks, which are key to stopping the reduction in our biodiversity. And you see the aspirations there of 500,000 extra hectares of land for nature and 75% of protected land in favourable condition, and all achieved by 2042. But the wildlife trusts, as an authoritative group of organisations, say we have to be far more ambitious. At least 2 million hectares needs to be put aside to restore nature. They're not specific about targets, but to be achieved by 2030 is a huge decrease in the time span. And also I think it is essential because things are so bad and getting worse. So I think I have to go along with the Wildlife Trust's view, and the governments are just basically too little too late. And doesn't it remind one of climate change? Exactly the same philosophy, which is absolutely hopeless. So the very significant Lawton report came out in 2010, Making Space for Nature, which really sums it up. We must make more space for nature. But you wonder about the time span and whether the government is actually serious about it. It's taken from 2010 right through to 2021 to 2 for the government to reveal plans which are relevant to this report, which is nature recovery networks, which have to be key to the recovery of our biodiversity. And then another 20 years before they're actually achieved. Don't you think that's totally inadequate? So looking at the nature recovery networks, unfortunately, the way things are going at the moment, many more people are visiting the countryside, but as a consequence, protected sites, and a great deal of damage is being done on wildlife sites of all sorts. And dogs are running free and so on, and I deal with this more fully in my lengthy video. But basically we are squeezing nature into less and less space to fit in with our plans. And nature recovery networks are a good idea, but then if we invade them as well, it just isn't going to work. I'm afraid it is disastrous. But at the same time, I recognise that there is a real dilemma here, that people do need space, green space, mentally and physically, to be healthy. And demands are growing, quite vociferous demands, to give all people more access to green spaces. I think that's fair enough, but there are all sorts of other spaces besides nature spaces. Probably we should be making recreation spaces and all sorts of other things, but not actually compromising the two and creating space for nature and then using it as green space for ourselves. I'm afraid there isn't enough room for it to work, and this compromise is just going nowhere. The issue of dogs is beyond dispute serious and potentially catastrophic. I have some stats here. A recent NFU Mutual study has found that 42% more people are taking dogs for walks in the countryside than before the pandemic, and 64% said that their dogs were off the lead. This is optimistic, of course. Probably there was rather more. I think my experience is that the overwhelming majority of people in protected sites, nature reserves, have their dogs off a lead. They don't control them. Anyway, of these 64%, 50% admitted that their dogs did not come back when called. 24% of those surveyed admitted that their dogs regularly chased other animals. And this really is just for starters as far as dogs are concerned. They are bad news on wildlife sensitive sites, and I'm afraid I think they should be banned. Fair enough in other places, but I think a line has to be drawn somewhere, and that is it. Yes, this is a serious accusation. We need to think long and hard about whether we really want to preserve our wildlife or just let it go to the dogs. We are not being led by the science, but by a twisted and often completely false narrative created by people who seem to have no concept of the truth or the implications of our current wildlife crisis for our children's futures. But the science is clear. We are leading the world in the destruction of nature and therefore, ultimately, ourselves as well. We are sleepwalking into a catastrophe. Quite bluntly, how stupid can we get? So finally, trying to end on a positive note, as you can see, here are a few things you might think of doing. One is looking at my longer video about what you need to know about the UK wildlife crisis. But perhaps more importantly, the next three items. We need to give nature and natural areas much more respect, rather than treat these places as some sort of recreation area where we can do what we want with no consequences. Nature needs more space, and it doesn't help if we crowd into sensitive areas in ever greater numbers. Such areas are where wildlife lives, not us, and we should treat them as we might when visiting a priceless historic building, or maybe a holy place, or the home of a revered benefactor who has looked after all our needs since we were born. Instead, when we visit these places, it's as if we think that no one cares or owns them. We leave litter, trample on the flowers, let our dogs chase the wildlife and create mayhem in the ponds, disturb the nesting birds, pollute the watercourses, and so on. The list is almost endless. Is this the way to behave? I don't think so. Point 3. We need to persuade our elected representatives of the need to act urgently on science-led plans to halt the loss of our biodiversity. Currently, we are simply not doing that. You can see from my talk that the government acts with duplicity and cannot be trusted. They may offer warm words, but the cold truth is that they weave a web of lies. Finally, we need a sea change in attitudes and stop thinking that the government knows best when all they're after is your votes and popular approval. They don't care about the future beyond the next 5 years, but their reckless decisions are existential, not just for wildlife, but ultimately for us too.